Hi, everyone, and welcome to the final week of technical writing. Today, we're going to be talking about lab report writing, and I'm going to both introduce you to the concept of lab reports, which many of you probably have written before and which differ radically from professor to professor, but we're also going to focus on what I want in your final lab report for the usability test. So, generally, lab reports have around 7 sections. All the sections appear in this order, and usually, especially professors, don't like when these sections overlap. They're kind of separate sections that work with one another, but the content in them, you're trying to really your hardest to prevent them from overlapping. So those sections we're going to go over today are the abstract, introduction, procedures, results, discussions, and conclusions and references. Sometimes they have slightly different names, so procedures might be called methodology, for instance, but generally these are the sections that you'll see in your classes and sometimes in publications like journal articles. So what goes in an abstract? An abstract is a really short paragraph that gives you the abstract, right, layout or summary of the article that you're writing. You usually write this last after you know your results, right? And after you've really written all the other sections, because the abstract should provide the reader with a brief summary of everything. The really good abstracts give a sentence or two from each one of the major sections of the report, which is why it's really easy to write last. So you talk about the problem, the hypothesis you have, how you're going to test the hypothesis, and some of your results. A lot of people don't like to give results or give away things in the abstract. You should. The abstract really, as a large-scale issue, is something for other authors when they're doing their research to read to see if they want to read further into your article. So you give everything away in this short paragraph. Common errors in the abstract are either too long or too short. They really should be one paragraph. They shouldn't be a full page. They shouldn't be one sentence. Or not specific enough. Again, include something from every section. Vagueness is a big deal in the abstract, and it's a big deal elsewhere in the lab report too, so you want to be really specific. So here's some examples of some vague sentences and why they're kind of not great. And these are from when I used to work as a professor who focused specifically in welding engineering at Ohio State. So steels are one of the most widely used materials in the world, and controlling their physical properties they possess has been an engineering challenge for years. So you don't need these vague kind of sentences to introduce your reader generally to the concept you're talking about. This introduction is a little too broad and student-like. Remember that all the information you provide should be useful to your audience and specific to the experiment. So this is way too vague. Number 2, each sample was viewed under high magnifications and these predictions were further investigated. That's really vague language. What do you mean when you say high magnifications? What predictions were investigated? What types of samples? Be very specific. Again, samples that have been water quenched had vast amounts of. Vast is a really imprecise measurement. Vast compared to what? Use specific numbers and talk about quotes and specific results in your abstract. And then finally, this experiment was performed to gain experience in metallography through comparing steels. We know from the very first assignment in this class, the application packet, that you want to avoid presenting yourself as a student. So this experiment wasn't performed for you to gain experience. This experiment was performed for you to prove a scientific test or to find some results, right? In this class specifically, our experiments performed to find solutions to a problem, right, using usability testing. So here's a sample abstract. In our abstract specifically, it should be talking about what scenarios you tested, what goals did you focus on, who were the participants you tested, what was the methodology you're using, and what were some of your key findings, right? It's more of an executive summary than an abstract because you're writing it to a client. So the big boss, give them the key takeaways in this abstract. Here's a good example. To provide ideas on how to improve the ease of use of the Norman Public Schools website, our team designed 2 scenarios and invited 2 participants to perform usability tests. The test results showed that the navigation to the nutrition facts of each item on the school menu can't be found, while the online account refill and the school menu are easy to be found if the user likes using the left navigation bar. The following report will describe in detail what we found based on our usability tests and what our team proposed for the usability improvement of your website. So there's good and bad things about this. The last kind of sentence there was a little too vague. I would stay really specific. And they only found one problem, but I bet there's more than one problem. What are the three minor problems that you're addressing in this usability test that you found? Summarize those as the kind of last part of your abstract. So the section of, or really the first body, main section of a lab report is the introduction, right? It should be under 2 pages generally, and these page counts differ radically. For us, it's just going to be 1 paragraph. The goal of the abstract is to create a context for the rest of the report. You introduce what you're doing in the experiment. You'll introduce all the theory, definitions, diagrams, and techniques that will be needed to understand the discussion section. This is where all that background reading and theory comes in and should be introduced. You should, later in the report, you shouldn't introduce any new theory, right? This is where all your theory goes. You also want to introduce your hypothesis. What is your goal? What is your hypothesis in your experiment? Describes the goals of the experiments, why you're doing it. You need to balance what the reader does and does not know, and describes what you might expect to see, obviously, as a hypothesis. Common introduction errors. Again, like the abstract, either giving too much or too little information. Don't go into the description of your specific procedures yet. Don't describe in great detail what you're going to be doing because there's a whole procedure section, a method section to do that. Also, don't give your reader information that won't be useful in understanding the experiment. Give them all the information they need to understand the experiment, but you don't need to give them definitions and details beyond what you're testing here today. What is common knowledge and what isn't is a big kind of question you need to figure out as a writer of a lab report in the introduction section. Again, you also don't want to give vague statements like, metallography is really important to welding engineering. Without it, engineering would not be what it is today. If you really want to tell us what metallography is and define it, tell me why it's important to what your specific experiment is about. Again, start specific and stay specific. Every piece of information you provide needs to relate exactly to what you're doing in this experiment. So in your introduction, you're really introducing those theoretical tools and teaching your reader about those so they understand what's going on later in your experiment and lab report. So in our introduction, you'd be explaining generally the processes you will use and your hypotheses. So what are our tools? Our tools are usability testing. What is usability testing? Why are you doing it? Who is the key audiences, user persona you're testing and why? Who are your subjects? What are the predictions and hypotheses you made in 4.1 on your 4 designs? Really, you can take a lot, and I'm fine with this, copying and pasting a lot from your first usability test report and putting it directly into this section. Use as much as you can from that first paper that you've already written, right? That you wrote last week. And because we're writing to clients specifically, it's okay to say something like, and you should really have phrases like, as discussed in our last report, we plan to blah, 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 right? Remind the client where you've already been together. Walk a careful line, a balance of explaining your theories without treating your client like they're an idiot. So here's a sample final project from another class semester for the Varsity House. We already looked at some examples from this. They start with a nice cover page. They have a really nice table of contents and a breakdown. And they have their abstract. And here's their introduction. Usability testing is incredibly important for small businesses to ensure that consumers are pleased with their online experience. This type of test consists of watching people try to use what you're creating, designing, building with the intention of making it easier for people to use. So a really great definition of usability testing. By observing the user experience firsthand, we can focus on things that are important to the actual users. This type of testing can increase site views, prospective residents, and even profits. So it's directing usability testing towards their website specifically, prospective residents. For this usability test, we tested the target market of college students with 2 college students at the University of Oklahoma. So it's interesting in introducing their users, right? The first design scenario was a freshman who is looking for housing for a sophomore year. The second design scenario was a student moving to Norman for graduate school. So they don't necessarily define what design scenarios are here, and I think they should. The test subjects were asked general questions about their background and then performed certain tasks on their website. As we discussed in our April 13th memo, it was predicted that the user would become frustrated with the lack of valuable information on the homepage and poorly labeled pages. So there's a hypothesis. Potential residents are looking for an easy-to-use website with well-organized information when comparing options, so it is important that you are able to design your website in a way that satisfies the requirements. This report details the user experience analysis performed in this usability test. So that's a great introduction. It introduces what a usability test is. It has their two scenarios. Those are the tools that you're talking about. I do wish they talked a little bit about some of the other data and how they collected data, but they usually should save that for your procedure or method section as well. So the next section is the procedure section. Think of this as an instruction set. You need to be very, very specific, describing exactly what you did. A lot of people like to create their procedures before the test, and you created your procedures really before the test already in your first assignment here. You describe what your scenarios are and why you made them in the way you did. This should be in the past tense, obviously. Even though you made your procedures beforehand, after you do your tests, you want to describe really specifically the other small things that you did and did not do in your usability test. So if something went incredibly wrong or different, you want to describe that, right? You also want to describe your materials in this section, what you did with them and what techniques you used. So if you used any technology, describe what that technology was. The big thing about procedure sections and lab reports that you want to remember is that you give a procedure section. The reason why you include it is because you want to create repeatable results. You want to create a procedure that another scientist can follow and get the same results to test whether your results were accurate. So common procedure errors, this is not a cooking recipe. And this is really for first-time lab report writers, but I've seen this a lot, right? It's the reason why procedure sections are different than instruction sets is because you shouldn't be giving orders. You're not saying first mount the Bakelite. You should be saying first samples were mounted in Bakelite. Again, it's that past tense kind of statement rather than the straightforward command. It should be in the past tense and describe what you did. Try to avoid personal pronouns, you, I, and we as well. You don't really need to do those. It's okay if you do, but in general you want to avoid those. Like instead of saying first we mounted samples in Bakelite, you can just say first samples were mounted in Bakelite. Most STEM professors like when you use that passive voice. So three metal samples of each 1018, 1045, and 4340 steel were given to each lab group. Prior to the lab, each sample was stamped with an 8 or a 5 followed by either the letter. You can see there's student language here. Don't refer to lab groups, don't refer to school, don't refer to me. You're writing in this, especially in this one, you're writing to a client, but generally when you're writing lab reports, you want to imagine that your audience is a journal article audience. They don't know about the University of Oklahoma, they don't know about what your professors gave you. You're really pretending to be a professional scientist. Another common error in procedure sections is bad repetition. The first heat treatment is to heat the steel to 950 degrees Celsius and keep it at that heat for 15 minutes. This step will be repeated in the following 2 heat treatments. So you see how heat is repeated like 4 times in this sentence. In general, in your writing, you want to avoid that kind of repetition. Obviously, don't skip steps. For instance, don't just say that the metal was polished. Tell me the different grits of sandpaper, the order of the grits, and how you cleanse samples between grits. Be really specific. I'm not going to be able to replicate this experiment unless you give me all the nitty-gritty details. Procedures also need to make sure that they don't blur into interpretation of data. They just describe what you did. So our procedure explains the specific procedures you described in your first report, why you designed them the way you did, and how they played out in actuality. Not analysis, but actually what happened in the usability test. You're going for replicability of the experiment in case your client wants you to repeat the test with a larger sample size or different types of users, right? So it gives the details of how you ran the experiment in the past tense, what was your protocol, your scenarios, how long did each experiment last, etc. Please do not describe results in this section. That's a big common error, is bleeding into results. Focus on your scenarios, give them fully, and design of the test. So again, there's some repetition from your first report. Give me the full intro script, the full homepage tour, and both scenarios, and also explain, again, like you did in the 4.1 in your first usability test proposal, describe to me why you designed these things and why you're doing them in the way you are. Explain to your client what's going on here and why. You can copy and paste this straight from 4.1. So here's a sample procedure section. I'm not going to go through all of this, but there's a good introduction to what procedure is. Here is a description of the demographics of both users. I would recommend you actually including your user persona in this as well. You're only doing one user in this experiment, mind you. We performed 2 usability tests of about 45 minutes each with a different participant. Before the testing began, we read a script to the participants that stated what they were. So I want the actual script. They didn't actually give it to me. They just described what was going on. Give me the actual script. The script and introduction may be viewed in our previous report. If you don't want to include it in the body report, include it in appendix. The scripted introduction may be viewed in blah, blah. Once the introduction portion of the test was completed, a general demographic survey was conducted. The demographic questions helped to determine participants' demographic information and validate the tests that our team was performing. The results of the demographic question are shown in Table 1. That's great, right? Great use of table and figure table number. Following the demographic questions, each participant was presented with the Varsity House homepage, did the homepage tour. Again, give me the actual homepage tour. Once participants began a filler test, Ms. Browning read the homepage questions. Okay, then they gave us the scenarios. Then they described this Think Aloud protocol here. I would define Think Aloud protocol in your introduction rather than in your procedures. They didn't necessarily just describe why they designed their scenarios in the way they did, which I want you to do. Once the participants had either completed their tasks or had given up, scripted questions were read and participants' responses were recorded. Participant 1 took a total of 4 minutes and 39 seconds to complete the testing, while participant 2 took 5 minutes and 35 seconds. Screen capture software and audio recording, along with written note-taking, were used to collect the data. We collected the following types of data. Here's the quantitative stuff they collected there.